Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
Well, we've spent some time away from the podcast, but back with another episode of the Professional Football Researchers Association podcast. Jon and George along with you, and pleased to have an author and kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to the game of football in terms of a researcher, and that's Chris Willis, who has been the head archivist at the NFL film since 1996. He's also the author of multiple books on professional football and was awarded the Pro Football Researchers Association's Ralph Hay Award for Lifetime Achievement in Pro Football Research, and so much more of what he has done. He also won an Emmy for his work on HBO's Hard Knocks in 2016. Very decorated, knows a lot about the game of football. And Chris, we appreciate you joining us.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad to be here, especially talking for the PFRA. You know, I've been a member since 1993, so it's been a while, 30 years. So happy to be here to chat about pro football history.
I'll make you feel old here for a second. I was born in 1993, just to give you a little bit of perspective on how long you've been researching the game of football. I wasn't even a thought in my parents' mind yet.
Wow.
And you were researching it.
That is going to make me feel a little old, but
I have that effect on people. I really do. You know, I was reading, leafing through the book before we came on here, and I was really fascinated by something that struck me. Now, this is two-way players during, as my dad called it, the single platoon era of football from 1925 to 1945, or 1920 to 1945. And something that struck me about this that I thought was the most unique is how many quarterbacks were on this list. Like Sammy Baugh, Patty Driscoll, so many others that we just know as quarterbacks probably now years later for leading the then Redskins and Packers. You know, these are guys that played both ways and were required to play all 60 minutes of the game because of how it is. In your research, how unique was it to look at the quarterback position back in those days and compare it to now, Chris?
Well, it's definitely, what they were asked to do back then is totally different, you know, obviously to what they do now, or what we conceive as, you know, the glamour position of quarterback. Back then, especially, you know, starting in 1920, a lot of the quarterbacks were mainly blocking backs. You know, they might call the play, at the line of scrimmage and sort of be the leader, but they, you know, the single wing and some of the offensive formations were geared towards the fullback and the halfback touching the ball, you know, and then the halfback and maybe the quarterback, you know, might throw a pass or two, you know, and then obviously, you know, players like Sammy Baugh came, you know, as a rookie in 1937, he could throw the ball anywhere, you know, so, you know, even out of the single wing. So that glamour position obviously did not come later. I think the thing, as you mentioned, that makes it very, unique to think about and talk about is that they did play for 60 minutes. You know, I mean, Sammy Baugh, you know, also kicked, punted, played defense. You know, with some of those guys today, you know, be asked to do that. I mean, you look at Peyton Manning and, you know, Tom Brady, Joe Burrow or something like that. You know, could they, you know, some of those players might have played, you know, both ways in high school, but eventually just said, you know, hey, you know, you're too valuable, you just play, you know, the quarterback position. But they were asked to do much more, you know, in the two-way era, you know, from the quarterback position.
Misspoke. It's Patty Driscoll, obviously played for the Bears. I said he was a Packer. I don't know where I guess I was same division either way. I wanted to touch on something too about that, because I remember when I was a kid and my grandfather telling me that he remembers going to see an area high school team play, and that when the quarterback got hurt, that the center was the guy who came in for the quarterback at the time. And I guess I was curious if you saw anything like that, like of weird substitutions. How did teams go about substituting in an era where it was just single platoon? And if you lost your quarterback, are you completely out of luck, or was there somebody that they had that could play the position somewhere else?
I mean, most of the players in the 2A era, were pretty versatile. They could do, because that's the way the game was played. So even like a Fats Henry, could carry the ball too. Obviously he kicked and he punted, and, he played offense, defense. So, and he's a 60-pound tackle. So. And for the most part, I mean, like I said, these guys are tough. They knew they were going to play 60 minutes, so it would be, maybe one, substitution, or if you injured, you really, really had to be injured, because, the main thing for, at the end of the day for some, most of these players were you wanted to get paid. So if you didn't finish the game or you got hurt, like, that somebody will replace you and you won't see the field ever again. So, so they were versatile. It wouldn't surprise me, somebody, who played on the offensive line, like a Fats Henry or a Mike Machowski, Mel Hunt, and these guys were very good athletes to begin with, that maybe they could have played, a similar or different positions, if they had to.
Yeah, no such thing as the concussion protocol in 1927, right?
No. Unless you were totally knocked out and you had to be carted off, put on the stretcher, you were going to stay in regardless if you saw stars, I guess.
That's a pretty harsh protocol, if you ask me. I mean, I'm glad they've advanced from that. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, Chris, I know you've read a number of books and with a real emphasis on the early days of pro football in the NFL, with your books on Red Grange and Dutch Clark and Bronco Nagurski, and one of my favorite football books of all time, your Joe Carr biography. Why the passion individually and personally in that area for you?
No, I love that question, just because, I mean, I'm originally from Ohio, so I grew up, in Columbus, and I grew up a huge football fan, Ohio State, and you had the Browns and the Bengals in the NFL, and obviously we're all, big fans of today's game. We love, playing in our Saturdays and our Sundays, Monday, Thursday, pretty much all week now. And, that's great. And it's everywhere. You can go and find videos and, online, everybody's talking about fantasy football, like everything's in your face now. So why do we love the game so much? And where did it start and where did it come from? So even working for NFL Films and even being, as passionate as I am about the game, I always, feel like that where it started, the pioneers, deserve their due, just as much as, Joe Montana and Jerry Rice are my favorite players. Well, I can go online and, or watch videos or read, several books on those players. But the players that started it, for pennies and sort of help establish the game, I think that's worth preserving and telling their stories just as much. Like I mentioned, you could find 4 or 5 books on Joe Montana, but if you go and look at Mel Hine or like you mentioned, Patty Driscoll and these great players, they don't actually have a biography, or they don't have a book written about them. And so it'd be nice to do this. So that's why, I've sort of gravitated towards that era and say, if I'm going to spend some time and an effort to preserve some or tell these stories, then I'm going to focus on, the 20s and 30s and the sort of, pioneering years of NFL, especially NFL history.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned Ohio, because obviously, I grew up in Canton, and I can identify with what you're saying, because
do people like football around here?
Yeah, they do. and I know growing up in Canton, within walking distance of the Hall of Fame. I mean, it was a history lesson for me and my friends growing up when, you know, the Hall of Fame parade and the enshrinement came, because, you know, back then everything was free, and, you know, we'd all go to the parade together, then we'd all go to the enshrinement together, and, you know, we'd see all these, I the first time I would hear names like Bob Waterfield and Hugh McElhaney and you know, some of the others that were in the charter class. So I think that's a common bond with people growing up in Ohio. No matter where you grew up, I think that's a common bond.
Absolutely. You know, I guess I felt real lucky to be born in that state. It's a heavy history of not only Ohio State football. You know, everybody loves, and, you know, it's the main school and football school in the whole state, but, you know, it's really heavy and rich history of pro football, and especially the NFL. So yeah, we should always cross our fingers and say, hey, we were lucky to be born with this environment. You know, not say you can't get that from other places, but I think especially in Ohio, you know, it's something that can get in your blood pretty early, and you just sort of absorb it.
I have to ask you a Columbus pro football history question, and then we're going to get back to the book. I have been in Columbus, and I've gone up Livingston, and I've seen a sign there for a park called Driving Park. And I've seen that the Panhandles used to play at a field called Driving Park. Is that the Driving Park? I've always wondered this. Is that the Driving Park where the Panhandles played?
I'm not sure if that's the exact spot. You know, it is close. So, I think Driving Park was off Livingston. I just have to see that intersection again to see, because it's changed. So it's where, you know, what the dimensions were at the time, you know, but I believe it is close within that area. Because they played at Neal Park, which now is like a big intersection too in Columbus. So it's a little unfortunate that they, you know, so, but it would have to see that intersection again to see where.
Chris, this is a beautifully researched book. What was your criteria for coming up with your list? Let me give you the more brief story. You talk about how I ranked them. Is that what you mean? That list, not the okay. Right. This actually started, you know, back in 2019 when the NFL celebrated its 100th anniversary or 100th season. They had the old-time team, and you know, John Turney, you know, one of the friends of PFRA, you know, on his website, Pro Football Journal, asked me to make some list of pre-World War II players of those positions. He was going to handle the post-war, and I was like, okay. So I wrote like little paragraphs or two, you know, not very long, but and then I would rank them. Okay, here's the, you know, the quarterbacks, fullbacks, ends, tackles, and I really enjoyed digging through, because a lot of these players, you know, I hadn't known as much about, or you start digging more research and you're surprised, you know, oh, hey, okay, this player might have been, you know, a little better than I thought. This player, you know, maybe had a little more headlines than accomplishments. And so that evolved into like, I wanted to do more. So, you know, it's ranked 1 through 45, because if I wanted to do 100, it would have been like a 600-page book, and McFarland or anybody didn't want a 600-page book of the 100 players. So we sort of, you know, met in the middle. You know, there's 45 full profiles, you know, from 1 to 45, and so I just dug in. I was just like, you know what, I'm going to just find, you know, as many. You know, I put a lot of weight into like interviews and testimonials, you know, from ex-players, coaches, you know, executives, you know, same thing with all-time teams. I didn't quite do it, but my goal was like to find an all-time team from, you know, every two-way member, you know. So, you know, Red Bagro, you know, I found his two-way team, you know, Joe Carr actually listed some all-time greats, you know, in the 30s at one time. So, in that, you know, combined with like game film, you know, watching as much as I could, you know, all decade teams, all pro teams, you know, there was a lot in newspapers and publications, you know, and the newspaper recaps,
team honors, stats, championships, playoff games, stuff like that. So I put all those together to say, hey, look, this is, I think there was like 12 criteria that I eventually came to. And, and I just said, okay, who sort of checks off a lot of these criteria or and then, that's where the list sort of started, top 10, top 20 and top 25. And certain things were very unique. Like, for example, everything's 1929. If you look at that season, Benny Friedman and Vern Llewellyn and Ernie Nevers were like the top three players. If you just looked at, maybe records and scoring, Nevers had that 6 touchdown game. He led the league in scoring by 20 points. So you think, oh, Nevers. But then when you looked at it, Nevers had 6 touchdowns against the Bears. Then he had like 3 touchdowns against Dayton, and I think another 2 or 3 against like Brook, like the 3 worst teams. He scored like 9 of it, or 12 of his like 14 touchdowns. So he's like, oh, you know what? He was doing that against weaker competition, So, so then you sort of evaluate that, and that's what I kind of did, and so some players, look a little more impressive than others and stuff. So that's where the list sort of developed and the rankings, sort of developed.
Chris Willis, our guest, been the head archivist at NFL Film since 1996. He's also an Emmy winner and was the Ralph Hay Award recipient from the PFRA. He's also written multiple books, a really well-decorated researcher of the game. Chris, I was reading this, and I wanted to read it here while we're talking. I'm reading about Dutch Clark here while we're talking, and I love this paragraph where you say, Dutch learned how to be a hard worker during his high school days. Quote, we didn't have anything. Times were bad. I quit school at 14 to work for a year. When I went back to school, I'd work at the railroad from 9 at night until 6 in the morning, then school, then football practice, then home to sleep. Mother would come in and wipe my face with a wet washcloth to get me awake for work, recalled Dutch Clark. These guys, I think we think of the game of football now as this, like, glamorous, like, lights, camera, action type of thing. It's entertainment, but these guys were just normal guys who happened to put on pads and a helmet, weren't they?
Absolutely. I think throughout the book, there's a lot of stories like that from these guys. Whether it was in high school, like 14's a little, or college, they did this, bus tables, or Bronco Nagurski, working in a factory, to help build up his muscles in Minnesota. So there's a lot of those type of stories, and that's what they did. They didn't know any better. It's like now, I think if you said that to a current player, and they would be like, what are you talking about? I mean, his mom woke him up at 5 a.m. so he can go work at the train station. Like, now all they know is, hey, I train from, 7 a.m. to 9, and I go to practice, or I go to meetings, and then we go to practice, we do walkthroughs. Like, that's all they know, even in the off season, they train. They don't, it's not like, oh, I'm going to go get a, secondary job, so it is unique to contrast and see where the players and how that, where they came from and what they did, to prepare themselves for actually playing.
Was there a particular story that maybe stood out to you above the rest of a guy that maybe people don't know that had a unique story like that? I mean, obviously the Dutch Clark story is really well documented in this, but is there another story that, really stood out to you and might be of interest to somebody listening?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, different ones. That, I mean, obviously, I'm partial to Red Grange, so here's, I think the thing that fascinates me about Red Grange is, he was the same way. Like, I think it was a sophomore year in high school. He, on a dare from, Mr. Thompson, who ran the ice company in Wheaton, that he couldn't pick up a 75-pound chunk of ice. He's like, oh, I'll give anybody $1 who can do it, knowing that none of these kids could do it. And all of a sudden, Red did it with ease. And then all of a sudden, he hires them to deliver ice, and becomes the Wheaton Iceman. But I think the fascinating thing about that is when you see some of the quotes and some of the stories that Red would tell, he really did it to improve his body and his stamina and his strength. He had many quotes that I found where he said, oh, I did it, to get ready for, especially football. That's why I would do it in the summer. Then I would be 2-3 weeks ahead of the kids who would, at the swimming pool or at the lake. He would, be 2 weeks ahead of all the kids. And repeatedly, there was quotes about him saying, if you don't build your legs, you're nothing, as an athlete. And, that's why your legs are important. I was like, this is 1924, 1925 that he's saying this. It sounds like somebody, today is like, oh, you got to work hard on your legs and your abs and your six pack or something. Like, Red was saying that, almost 100 years ago. So those stories, like I said, were very fun to see. And I tried to include a decent amount of those, because it came from their words and their interviews, to explain, what made them great, too, and it wasn't just me, trotting out words of, and explain how great they were. They were telling, hopefully the reader, how they became that way. So.
Well, and I know from at the previous convention this past summer, last summer, you spoke about, Red Grange and the barnstorming tour that he went on, and I thought it was fascinating hearing you say that it was like a Saturday afternoon, and then, Monday it's like, oh yeah, let's play another game. Like, oh, Monday's done, like let's play another game on Wednesday. Like, let's just like wait a day in between these games and like just keep playing and like go on this tour. And like I just think about that now. Like if Tom Brady was to play a game on Sunday, like they wouldn't be like, hey Tom, you want to play a game on Monday now too? Like, see how that works out for you and your 45-year-old body. Like, that wouldn't happen. These guys were almost like, I won't say superhuman, but they kind of had that. They kind of had to just kind of roll with the punches of the time, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean that was. I mean that barnstorming tour, where I think at one time they played seven games in 12 days. I mean that was ridiculous.
That's insanity.
But it wasn't uncommon. In the 20s, even through the 20s and 30s, especially 20s, teams playing at least 2 games a week, or, sometimes 3, especially like the Frankfurt, Blue Laws on Sunday. Frankfurt would play a game on Saturday and they go travel and play a game on Sunday. They did that repeatedly, playing back-to-back games. And so it was definitely, it sounds unusual now, but like you mentioned, they didn't know any better. So, it was an extra game. Hey, an extra payday, let me go out there and play.
I think one of the fascinating things about the book for me is obviously in your top 100, there's obviously a number of Hall of Famers in there, but there's also a number of players that are high up on your list that are not yet in the Hall of Fame. I know this is always a topic of hot discussion on the PFRA forum, that many of these players from these earlier eras have been overlooked. And I know that, as you're probably aware, Cliff Crystal, the Packers historian, right after your book came out, wrote a rather impassioned plea in favor of Vern Llewellyn, who is, I believe, the highest non-Hall of Famer on your list. Why Vern Llewellyn and why that high placement?
Yeah, I mean, that's a small spoiler alert, but no. For me, no. Yeah, he's the highest on my list. He's in the top 10, and to me, the more I looked at him and the more I did research, like the more he stood out. Him almost like Dutch, who I think probably, the best two-way player. He actually did the 2 most important aspects of the two-way era, almost better than anybody, and that's punting and scoring. So it was not a passing game. It was not, a receiver's game. It was more about field position and can you put, points on the board, whether it's, 3 points or a touchdown. So, and when you look, I think if I have my numbers right, there was like 21 backs from the 2A era that's in the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. And, he is number one in touchdown score. I believe it's 51. Mm-hmm. And so he scored more touchdowns than any of the other 2A backs, whether they're a fullback like Nagurski or Nevers, quarterback like Ball, or Luckman, or any of the halfbacks. He scored 51 touchdowns, and he was probably outside the ball maybe the best punter of the 2A era too. Cliff Crystal has made a lot of good points on just his punting skills and how great of a punter he was. And like I said, you see a bunch of 3-0 scores in especially in the 20s and into the 30s, before they opened the game a little bit. Field position was probably the most important thing. You wanted to control field position, make the mistake, and then you capitalize. And so for Llewellyn, and I mean those are the two most important things. And then you get to he was the best player on the team that won 3 straight NFL championships. The Packers won 29, 30, and 31, and he was the guy that was the one that ran the car and ran the machine. So not only he performed, I think, as well as anybody in that era, he was also a champion. Like I don't think too many others best players out of some franchises that won either 2 or 3 championships. Tom Brady's going to get in. Troy Aikman, Joe Montana, like all these players, Bart Starr, Otto Graham, who won multiple championships and who were the best players on there, are in the Hall of Fame, but he is not. So, yeah, he's definitely the highest. I don't know how he got sort of lost and through the cracks. But I would go to bat for him, as my guy from the 2A, or even from the that probably deserves the most chance of or should have the best chance of getting into Hall of Fame if they brought his name back up.
Yeah, no more spoilers from my end. I just had to ask
okay.
I had to ask you the question about Llewellyn. Another player I had in mind that I didn't see on the list, and this is more of a general question. Bob Waterfield, who was obviously at one point in his career a 2-way player, he kissed this era because he started his career in 45. But I didn't see him on the list unless I missed his name. Was that part of your criteria too, that they had to play most of their career during that era? Because obviously he was right on that cusp.
No, I'm a huge Bob Waterfield fan. He's great. I kept it to that, to like, okay, the first 25 years of the NFL, 20 to 45, because I didn't really want to get into the, for the most part, those players played both ways the entire time. So once you got to the end of World War II in like 44, 45, and then until we got to the 2-platoon system, not everybody played both ways, so I didn't want to get into that. Because a lot of people, when I say, this is my new book title, and they say, so Chuck Bednarik. And I'm like, no, Chuck Bednarik's not on the list.
Right.
Because he was just the last to do it. Now it's a great accomplishment. Like he's the last to go 60 minutes, but he wasn't playing players who were going both ways too. Right. So to me, that's more of an individual achievement more than, I'm ranking guys who all played against each other, for 60 minutes, so that's why I sort of stopped it there, because guys like you mentioned, Waterfield won, and then guys like Charlie Trippi, George Connor, even Otto Graham played a little DB time. Waterfield's in there, so I didn't want to get it to take it to 1950, and then you got some of these gray area guys, and that's the same thing. Somebody like Graham, Well, Graham only did it like his first year, and then he stopped. Luckman did it until after he got, and then he stopped playing both, or playing a lot of defense. So I didn't want to get into that to where, okay, how many games did these players actually play both ways? So I stopped it at 45. Because Waterfield was another one that was tremendous in everything. Whether it was offense, as a quarterback, passing, he's great defense, ball hawk, and he was really great punter and kicker too. So, would have liked to have seen him play a little bit more in the era to have. And I think in the criteria I put also that you had to play at least 3 years of at least 3 seasons or 3 years to be eligible, because there was a couple of guys who I liked that I kind of wanted to include. Was Charlie Berry, who eventually became an umpire, and Paul Robeson, but each of them only played 2 years. And I was like, are you going to put them on there if they only played like 20 games? So even as really good and great as they were, so I had to find a balance of especially with years played and the years I wanted to cover.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Bednarik, because I think, obviously people think of him, but he was obviously not this year, and you said it was a little bit different then. And I think he really liked to play up his legend too, of being the 60-minute man, and even the hit on Gifford. I remember hearing a story one time when they were both speaking at an engagement, and Bednarik had them turn the lights out completely in the hall, and then had them come back up, and he looked over at Gifford and said, "Remember this, Gifford?" So, he loved to play that up.
Yeah. There were some games where he played mainly defense. He was,
right. He was a center,
a great outside lineman, and
right,
So, but he did play that up. He loved.
Yeah. Oh yeah. He loved to play that up. Yeah.
Chris Willis, our guest, an archivist at the NFL Films, also an author, Emmy winner. Chris, I feel like he kind of gets lost in the shuffle of this discussion, but the guy who's number 2 on the list is one of my all-time favorite players. I really don't think there's ever been a wide receiver greater than him, and I say that about Don Hutson because this was an era where teams primarily ran the ball, and he had 1,200 yards receiving in one season. I think it was like 1942 or something like that. Can you make a case as to why you think Don Hutson is basically like the Jerry Rice of his day and maybe deserves more respect than what he ultimately gets?
Yeah, I think Don was a tremendous player. We have, especially some of the footage I was able to find, like you could tell how elite he was. When you watch Packer games and you watch what he did, you're like, man, that guy, you knew that guy was different. It's similar to like when you watch Dutch and you watch Sammy, like you knew this play, like, cause if you watch film, especially, some of the game clips, if you want to, the game is definitely slow. A lot of people look at like, wow, this is slow, so you tend, but that's just the way the game was, but some guys will just stand out, and you're like, and you mentioned like, is Don Hutson like Don could play in today's game? Like there's no doubt. Like even just his frame, like even was he 6 feet, 185 pounds? Like he would be a Marvin Harrison, Devontae Smith. Like he could play today. And where some guys you might look and could be limited, but Don Hutson, when you see him and you see like, he was special. I went back and forth. I would have said like, before I did a lot more Dutch Clark research, he probably would have been number 1. Thinking, who would be number, and so I went back and forth a little bit, but there's no doubt Hutson, is special, and like I said, he should always be up there with Jerry Rice when they talk about great receivers.
You mentioned that you feel he could play in today's game. Are there other guys that you look at from back then and you say this guy would still be dominant in today's game? And if so, who are some of those guys?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a handful of guys from this era. I'm not taking, like, especially if you put them in, like, especially someone like Sammy Ball or Mel Hine. Like, Mel Hine was in 2024 with all the things that are provided, you know, whether it's nutrition, you know, weight training, speed. Like, Mel Hine would be an inside. He'd be Brian Urlacher, you know, like I mentioned, you know, with Bronco Nagurski would probably been Larry Zonka, you know, like those guys, you know, were physically gifted, you know, same thing with Don Hudson and Vern Llewellyn, you know, I mean, the tackles like Cal Hubbard, you know, Turk Edwards, like there's a lot of guys that just physically were just very, you know, better than, you know, some of the players in the era. So if physically they were gifted, you know, someone like a Hudson or a Dutch Clark or a Patty Jerson, then all the stuff that is provided would have made them, you know, just as good, you know. So if you look at somebody that was limited, you know, I mean, Fats Henry was very good athlete back in his day. And he was nifty on his feet, you know, but he might have to do a little bit different. I don't see him being quite as dominant, you know, as some of the other players, you know, so, or somebody that was, you know, just okay, you know, as pretty, like as an athlete, you know, and having, you know, some measurables and having some athletic ability.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was watching something on, it was either Twitter or YouTube, or I can't remember. It might have even been TikTok, and somebody was pointing out that they were saying, they were showing the Celtics of the 1950s and 60s, and somebody was saying Bob Cousy could never play in today's game. And then somebody sat down and they were like, look at how Bob Cousy handles the basketball and controls the game. And it's like, the thing that it showed is that great dribblers, great fundamental guys are going to be great in any era, regardless of where you put them. Like, Mickey Mantle wouldn't just magically not know how to hit a fastball in 2024. Like, he's still going to know, you know. Don Hudson is still going to know how to beat his corner off the line and get open downfield. So, you know, dudes then would be dudes now. And I think sometimes that gets lost on people. They're like, oh, they were firemen and they were bus boys. Like, what do they know about football? Well, they were still great athletes.
Yeah, and you can see that, like, when you watch Don, like, you watch the other end on the Packers, he doesn't do the same thing as Don Hudson, you know, or the ends on the Bears, although Hewitt was pretty good, or the Cardinals, like, you know, and, you know, the Redskins. Like, if you look at the other ends, or like the quarterback, I mean, Sammy is a perfect example. You know, you watch him throw, and then look at some of the other players from the 30s and into the 40s, and watch him throw, and you're like, nah, there's a huge difference. Like you said, he's a dude. These other guys are just, you know, parts. You know, they're just parts. Yeah, you know. So, and you can't. Yeah, and like I said, I would never be one, like, you can't tell me, you know, that the game or these players wouldn't be able to play, or like you mentioned, like Cousy. No, if you have skill, you know, and some, you know, an athletic ability, you can translate that into, oh, look, he would be, you know, maybe 20 pounds heavier, and he'd be, you know, a few seconds faster. So, because he would work on that, like, you know, some of the guys do today, you know, year round.
We just went to the senior golf tournament that was here in Akron a couple weeks ago, and we were standing on 16 at Firestone, which is known to be this big 600-yard par 5. And I kept turning to my dad, and we both watched golf. He grew me up on the game of golf. And every time a major champion that was on the senior tour would come through, they would stick it close. And any time a guy would come through that just was a journeyman, they'd hit it to like 30 feet. And every time it would happen, I would turn to my dad and I would say, that's a major champion. And again, it proves the point that you can always tell there's a difference between guys that won great things and guys that are just guys.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's perfect analogy, you know, of and that, you know, like I said, that's, you know, a great thing about debating history, you know, like you get into that without just coming out and, you know, do the, you know, grandfather on the porch, you know, our generation was better, or you guys are like, no, it's, just take it for what it is, and then, you know, make an educated, you know, discussion. and say it. Some guys, yes, Tom Brady could not play both ways. He's not going to cover Don Hudson in the 1920s, or Peyton Manning, but look what he does in the passing game in 20, maybe Manning could have done that, or Brady could have done that, it's definitely better than to just, write it off.
Chris, you have two other sort of fascinating parts of the book in that you looked at retro MVPs, and I don't want to spoil that for our readers, but you went through this whole sort of gave a history of the MVP award, and you went through that, and then also at the end you also come up with an all two-way team. What went into those parts of the books just generally? Those
were especially the retro MVP. That was one of the fun tasks to do, because I did do a few of the years for Pro Football Journal, and that sort of got me started. I wanted to do like the entire 20s and 30s, but everyday life and everything comes in the way sometimes when you do research. But I definitely wanted to do it. So I went back to, newspapers, and I looked at, the stats that were available, if they were, and just sort of, and team success compared to, like I mentioned, with Nevers in 1929. I think we just looked at the records and the stats. You think, oh, Nevers, dominated, maybe they didn't win the but then it's again, like, no, it was Benny against Llewellyn, and Llewellyn, beat Benny Friedman in New York in the most important game in 1929. Mm-hmm. So it was fun to go back, because I wanted to put that in a little perspective. A perfect example is somebody like Fritz Pollard. Well, Fritz Pollard, didn't play as many years as you thought. He bounced around for what, about 5 years there. But in 1920 with Akron, your hometown, he was the best player in the APF in the first year of the NFL, and the Akron Pros won the championship. And you could see through some of the game recaps and some of the testimonials and things like that, they're like, hey, he made an impact, and I took a lot of weight into that, especially for the MVP, impact, especially for the season, and impact in the most important games, and Pollard did that. He had, punt return for a touchdown, I believe against Dayton in the middle, and, some of his defense, some of his stuff against Canton. And so, because then that just gave me an extra layer, like, you mentioned Patty Driscoll. Well, Driscoll had a, good 3 or 4 year run there where, I think he won 2 of my retro. It's like, okay, that's why he's elevated on the list, because now we can kind of look at, like, okay, Brett Favre won 3 MVP, Peyton Manning, won his share. You can quantify it a little bit and put it, into a rankings or a system, a criteria that you want. And I just didn't want to do that without saying, hey, you know what? Who were the best players in these years? And the guys, who I thought were good also, stood out in the retro MVPs, So that was key. I definitely wanted to do that. I wish I could have expanded more. I think I had top 5s for each year in the book. I wish I could do a little bit longer write-up, but, like I said, that was going to be an extra, 30, 40 pages. Sure. So I just put the top 5, and then I put, like, a short paragraph of what sealed it, for me,
Yeah, it reminded me of a book that I have in my non-football library called Alternate Oscars, where a guy basically looked at the Academy Awards for each year for Best Picture and Best Actor and Actress. And he got, and it's sort of the same as you. He sometimes still, picked the film that won, but and the actor and actress. But in a lot of cases, he said, well, actually, in terms of history and everything else, and looking away from the politics, he picked some other winners, and one year he didn't even pick a winner at all. So it sort of reminded me of that same kind of idea. And I think that's an enjoyable thing to have in a book in that regard, to look back at that and to do that. So
I like that. And that was the thing is, sometimes I agreed with, when it was the Joe Carr MVP, or I think there was one MVP for Jack McBride in 1927 that a newspaper, so I went back and like, yeah, you know what? I agree. Don Hudson was dominant, like you mentioned, 1,200 yards and 17 touchdowns, whatever, in 41 and 40. Like, oh, yep, he is the or 42. It's like, oh, yep, he's the MVP, and So there were a few, like, if you look back at the Joe Carr MVP, like I think Frankie Cinchwick won one, and I'm like, he was on a Detroit team that went like 6-5. I was like, why? And he was solid, but I was like, he's not the MVP of the league, especially when you're just okay and your team goes 6-5.
Yeah.
We would not pick a MVP now whose team just goes 500. Let's give it to Deshaun Watson because the Browns go 500. So
sort of like Paul Hornung winning the Heisman over Jim Brown.
And the team is a 500 team. What are they, 5-5 or something like that? Yeah, they weren't even really good.
No.
Nice job bringing us back to reality, Chris, and just.
Oh no, I definitely wanted to throw the Northeast Ohio in there for you.
Yeah. No. It's a good reality check that by week 7 we'll be watching Jameis Winston toss passes to some scrub.
Chris, for our listeners, how can they purchase the book?
The book was published by McFarland. I think a lot of the PFRA and they know McFarland. So if you go on their website, you can purchase there. You can also do your regular Amazon or Barnes and Noble, and they're the purchase on those websites.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's a great book. Like I say, it's detailed research and analysis, and I think any of our football historian fans will really, really enjoy this book. I know myself, I enjoy books that have lists and analysis like this, and I think most football researchers and football historians love this kind of book, and I think it's just a great idea and a great book.
Yeah, it's a really easy read, Chris. I can just leafing through it the last couple days, it's an easy read, and I would recommend it to anybody who's trying to learn about the early game of football, because I think it needs a spotlight put on it. So thanks for your work, and thanks for doing that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's why I laid it out that way, because you can pick it up, you can read one or two profiles, and you can put it down, or if you're watching and you got halftime and you want to waste 10 minutes, reading one chapter. And that's always nice. Like I said, I'm a big fan of that type of style too.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Chris, thanks for your time. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you in Cleveland here over the next couple days. All right.
Absolutely. Looking forward to being back in the Buckeye State.
Sounds good, Chris. Thanks for the time.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.